Sempre assim. Sim, sim. No, no, no. Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and people here in the room and people connected online. And we are glad to host this event here under initiative of DPIN, the DPIN project. And I mean, we continued our activities online, and this is the first hybrid event with a large physical presence here in Brussels. So we are happy about it. And the topic is a very hot topic. A few years ago, probably, thinking of organizing an event on technical standardization. It was probably, I mean, very important, but not so hot, probably, common understanding, while now it really is very, a very important and relevant topic beyond people, I mean, day-to-day engaged in these activities, but everyone, many people at least, have understood the importance of this topic. Of course, the occasion is the new European strategy that was presented in February, and of course the discussions are ongoing. We know that there is a discussion ongoing, for instance, is a group technical standardization. There are so of course there is a very important geopolitical dimension that will be discussed later in our panels, and of course there are very important technical issues also discussed concerning the development of important technologies, key, I mean, to the European competitiveness. Just to give some examples, 5G, but I mean, there are several technologies that heavily depend on, rely on technical standards. And of course, the European role is relevant, and we know that I mean other countries such as China, I mean to drop a name, has ambitious strategy in terms of standardization. Of course, the US, being the technological leader, has developed, I mean, decades, a very strong attitude to standardization, and so Europe wants to maintain and keep the lead, or gain, I mean, in respects the lead, has to hardball, and but also at the same time the relation with, for instance, the US, I think is very could be, I mean, very instrumental, and I'm sure, I mean, some discussion will revolve around it. And but I would leave to Antonio Manganelli, that is coordinating, chairing, I mean, and moderating the first panel. And I'm asking also to the panelists, starting from Sophie Müller, to take seat here, and Chiara Giovannini and Guido Lobrano. And please, Antonio.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefano. And my name is Antonio Manganelli, and I am a professor of antitrust regulation at the University of Rome LUMSA, and also working for for a few days more for the Italian government, for the cabinet, in the cabinet of the Ministry of Economic Development, taking care of the technology and telecommunication and digital issues. And I'm very glad to be here. This panel, I expect this panel to be very interesting because, of course, of the topic, which is very hot and stimulating, but also because of the quality of the speaker and also the let's say, the different approach to this topic that the speaker most probably will have. And that's, as Stefano said, that's something that is maybe not for the people involved here because they've been dealing with standard for a lot of time, but for the public debate, the more general debate, is becoming a topic which is looked at in a different perspective, from a mere technical matter issue to a more, let's say, it's said to be geopolitical, but even in a more simple terms, a policy issue. In fact, the unit which Sophie is heading is standards policy, just mentioning, highlighting that the fact that standardization is not a mere technical activity, but it's a proper policy, and different from a technical activity which can be approached and taken in a standalone matter, so not really considering the environment. When we go to a policy, you have to consider all the implication and the interaction with all other policies, so the competition policy, innovation policy, consumer policy, and that's what I guess the new strategy is looking at, starting from a new approach to the effectiveness and of the governance of the European standardization system and the agenda setting, and that from there, of course, it's a first step to defining a new standardization policy, which is looking at standardization in a more strategic way in order to enhance the voice and the action of Europe in a globalized context. Of course, standardization has political aspects because it's somehow related to the autonomy of Europe and also what is called technical sovereignty of Europe, which I like to define as there are a lot of definitions, but one that I really like, which I think capture the essence of the concept, is the fact that the ability, technical sovereignty, the ability to approach, to define how technology would affect, would impact on the citizen of a political community and also on the principle and the value of that political community. So it's a kind of autonomy which, of course, does not correspond at all to autarky. It's a completely different thing. It's just the ability to be able to interact in a globalized context on a level playing field with the other actors, taking into account all the interests, principles, and values that underline this new within bracket, within new policy. So I will give now the floor to the panelists, which are very distinguished. We have here Sophie Müller, who is the head of unit of the standard policy unit in DG GROW. We have Chiara Giovannini, Deputy Secretary General of ANEC, so-called European Consumer Voice about standardization. We have Guido Lobrano, who is Senior VP and Director General for Europe of the Information Technology Industry Council, which represent the innovative companies and a global, worldwide from the ICT industry. And we have also online connected Michael Locke, who is Associate General Counsel of GSMA. So I will give the floor to Sophie to have a first, let's say, look at the new standardization strategy and policy.
Okay, I first need to sort out the micro, but I think I will manage.
You can use either this one or that one.
I will take this one.
Yeah.
Voila. Now I have to start with all these glorious introductory remarks. Thank you very much. And thank you as well for organizing this. It's really nice to see an audience. of course, also hello to the people online, but it is very nice to start the rentrée with an event on standardization. And who would have thought, huh? I mean, I sometimes say we're experiencing something like a political renaissance in standards. I mean, some people like to quote Werner von Siemens from 1890, who used to say, those who have the standard get the market. And nowadays, we realize again that standardization is much, much more than what we had in our awareness. And we might have taken our jewel, the European standardization system, for granted, and also our global leadership for a long time for granted. Now, when we prepared the strategy, of course, I have not been in standardization for 20, 30 years. We always knew that standardization was very important, but what came as a very strong realization was that if we look at the von der Leyen agenda, and if we look at our resilience objectives, at the green and digital transformation, and also if we just look now at the State of the Union, that a lot, like many of our policy objectives, we will not realize without technical specifications or standards, right? And what is a standard? I mean, if we look at raw materials, the challenges that we now globally have in terms of resilience, in terms of sourcing, in terms of sustainable mining, standards will play a very, very big role in defining what is sustainable mining and defining recycling. The same with hydrogen, and I don't even want to start with the digital agenda, where really at the moment a geopolitical race almost for standardization is happening. Also, when we prepared the strategy, we were very conscious of the global landscape, and I hate to admit it, but China set a very, very important marker with their standardization strategy actually 1 year ago, which was issued by the Prime Minister's office. I think if you know China, it cannot have the higher political importance, and which was very assertive and said, we want to be an international leader, we want to lead in these technologies, and we want to be the first to develop these technology standards. So this global competition as well in terms of who has the standards, who is producing the best standards, was a big awareness when it came to the development of the strategy. Now, you have prepared a very beautiful paper. I don't need to recap everything that is in the strategy, and obviously you have all read the paper. But the strategy is relatively straightforward, right? We have 5 chapters. We have identified sort of 5 areas where we believe we should take action. And the first starts with our own standardization system, being also critical to ourselves and being aware that we don't always deliver fast. We don't always deliver where we need it. So to have a sort of prioritization also in this system, while of course maintaining the fabric of the European standardization system, which we believe is a strong, strong asset because it has to be a multi-stakeholder driven approach. Now, the first message here is we need a sort of, at least from the European Commission side, prioritization exercise so that we know where we want to develop the standards better and faster, but then also to know how we position ourselves with the stakeholders internationally. And for this, we have done a couple of proposals, meaning we want to set up this high-level forum on standardization, where we want to have with the stakeholders a discussion on what are the priority standards. We have the function now in the European Commission of a Chief Standardization Officer since June. And there are 2 things. The first is to give a signal to the outside world that standards matters, and that actually every company should have a Chief Standardization Officer in our view. Commissioner Breton always says standards belong in the boardrooms, and him having been a CEO for a long time and grasping very well the importance of standardization, This is a message that we always want to pass with this post, but in particular also to aim at more coherence and consistency to standardization within the European Commission. We have hundreds of colleagues working every day on standards, and we want to create that internal alignment and valorizing this work, and this is also why we want to have this excellence hub within the Commission. Now, when it comes to the legislative proposal that we have put forward, and this also links a little bit to the fact that we have this very unique system, actually unique in the world, of harmonized European standards, or this public-private partnership, as we call it, where the Commission can request standards from the European standardization system to support policies and legislation, in particular legislation. And the Court has said that harmonized European standards are quasi-EU law. And for this, we wanted to bring consistency and, in particular, EU integrity into the system, meaning that we gave a lot of trust to the national standardization bodies, the DINs, the AFNORs, the NENs of the European Union, to really be the drivers in the decision-making, but in particular also to take up a responsibility and do multi-stakeholder approaches and consultations, so that we have the biggest possible impact in the standards process. Now, not all NSBs are currently I will not speak because it's horrible for the people online, maybe. Is it better?
I think so.
Yeah. We know that there are also some issues within the ESOs, but also at national level within the NSB. So this is why we have encouraged everybody to also work on reforms, and we are going to monitor that. Now we come to the tricky part, the geopolitics, no? Geopolitics of standardization, the big, big topic. There are two things. The first, that we have never had really a strategic approach to international standardization. We have never linked the activities in ISO, IC, ITU, but there are many, many more standard development organizations actually, to our policy priorities, and then worked in an alliance of like-minded partners, or also with our leverage that we can have as a union with the member states and the national standardization bodies to work together on some objectives. And this is something we want to put forward. There comes also the TTC in place already that you mentioned in the introductory remarks, where we have a first understanding that we do have a lot of convergence, at least when it comes to our values and our interests. Not always. We also have cases where we don't converge, but where we have to join up forces. And the same with Japan, the same with Australia. I will also not exclude China, although we have a lot of disagreement with China, of course. But this is very important, because very often international standardization is under the radar. And unfortunately, we don't have also the same stakeholder inputs at international level that we would like to see. And then two topics which often don't receive the same attention but should. The first is pre-normative standardization. We are working on, at the moment, something that's called the Horizon Booster, so standardization booster, where we want research projects to go sort of through a standardization project to see if their projects are fit for purpose, because frankly, if as a research project, you can already have some norm-related deliverables, you have a very high chance to enter the market. And we have seen it also from an investor's perspective that the valorization of a research project, it's IPR, but it can also be standardization. If you have a standard, you are more likely to get money. And then education and skills. I always say it, we can have the best policy papers, the best objectives. If we don't have the experts in Europe, nothing will happen. The European standardization system rests on 100,000, maybe even 130,000 technical experts in the European and the national, across the European fabric. And this is a lot of in-kind investment from industry, from civil society. Standardization is expensive. Standardization takes time. Standardization is very technical. It is not yet sexy enough to attract the right people, and we need to invest, and we need to bring it on the table, and we need to talk about it, and we need, and this is also where the function of a chief standardization officer comes in. If you start in a company and you end up in the standardization department, well, this is very likely your end of career point. It used to be, at least, and this cannot be the case. It needs to be linked to a strategy department, to a legal compliance department, to a market access department. And this is sort of also something that we are discussing now with trade associations, with some companies which want to launch some projects, because they also realize they need to increase. And I don't want to put a certain company name here into the room, but we know of a Chinese company, they have 65 people just on standards around the corner sitting close to Brussels. And this is just to monitor what is happening in Brussels. I can tell you some of the biggest European companies have departments of 8 to 10 people for global standardization. This is an investment. This is, of course, expensive, and I know, but we need to make it a career opportunity, and we need to just pitch it. So we will hope that we will have something like EU University Days. We will have to think about attractive projects, but this is very dear to my heart, because we know that the generation of standardization experts is aging, and they are very good experts, but they might not be here forever, and we need to fill the 120, 130, and I mean, issues like artificial intelligence, Chiara, it is a race for standard experts. I mean, people earn so much money if they can work on artificial intelligence standards. It is complicated, it is difficult, but it is a career opportunity. So here we go. I'm done.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sophie. And no, that's right. I mean, the capacity building, human resources is fundamental, like in each activity, and it's a good opportunity, and it's also necessary. So it's impressive the gap that you underlined between how some Chinese companies invest and resources put on standardization compared to European. So that's something for sure that has been should be modified, should be taken in order to have a more balanced outcome. And we'll go back in the second round after a while. Now I give the floor to Chiara Giovannini from ANEC, as Deputy Secretary General of ANEC, and asking her what is under the perspective of a consumer association, what is the importance of the new standardization strategy, and also why is important for consumer, because one could tend to think that standardization with the old, let's say, technical glasses is not really relevant for consumers, but of course it is, and it's going to be more and more important in time. So please.
Thank you very much. No?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes?
Yeah.
Super. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me on behalf of ANEC to be here. As you mentioned, ANEC is the association representing consumers in standardization, and we were established in '95. So standardization is something that is not new to us, and we have seen some different approaches in terms of strategy on standards. But why do we exist? Because standards are, at the European level, are linked to legislation. As Sophie mentioned, we have the specific use of standards in the harmonization of the conditions to put the products on the market in the single market. Those standards have a specific effect of presumption of conformity with the legislation. It is therefore essential that the stakeholders that are concerned by the legislation are also present in the standards that are implementing the legislation. It is the democratic approach to standardization, and this is what Europe is about, is democratic approaches to whatever we do. Because they provide presumption of conformity, the standards are attractive. They are attractive for whoever wants to dominate a market. And what we have noticed in our many years of existence is that there is a big change in the market players. Because from a single market composed by member states and with economic operators that were active in the single market, mainly European companies, we have moved to international companies. And a company is international when they are active on more countries or more continents, but mainly international companies are the companies that are not originating from Europe. And if you look at the agendas of today, many of the interests represented are not European companies. But as consumers, we still have old values. We are still very much into privacy, personal data protection, fundamental rights, those kind of things. So we need a system that is protecting those values. Because of the very important influence of foreign companies at the European level, we welcome very much the standardization strategy that is starting to put some order in the decision-making in order to limit the undue influence of foreign interest. And the geopolitical aspect is very present in the digital sphere, but not only. Now, this is part of the strategy, is especially part of the revision of the standardization regulation, as Sophie explained. But then we need to go into those rules of the decision-making in the standards world, and how are those decisions taken? And what we notice and we wonder is that those rules were made for a system that was delivering for the internal market, as I mentioned. However, now we have global markets. So is the so-called national delegation principle still adapted to provide a high level of consumer protection in terms of standards content? Should we have a different approach? This is something that will have to be explored further in the discussions on the implementation of the standardization strategy. And then if we could suggest some additional elements that I know are going to be developed further by the European Commission in the standardization strategy, is to consider indeed if the legal basis on standardization, the essential regulation, needs to be revised in light of what I just explained, and also the need to ensure the substantial participation of stakeholders, civil society in standardization. As I was mentioning, standards are interesting for whoever wants to dominate a market. As consumers, we don't dominate markets, but we are 50% of the market in terms of demand. If there is no demand, there is no offer. And we believe that civil society in general has to be given the possibility of participating in standardization in a sustainable manner. I will have other points, but I will take a little breath now, and I will stop to leave the floor to Guido.
Chiara. And now we give the floor to Guido Lobrano, Senior VP and Director General for Europe, the ITI. And one consideration is that, of course, your association it's global association, so representing stakeholders from all the world. So one aspect of the standardization now, that's one of the reasons which is getting into, let's say, geopolitics, is the increasing complexity of standardization, both because of the globalization of the activity. Of course, global standards in a way are much more preferable than regional standards for a lot of reasons, consumer reasons, for the industry, for the return on the investment, and all these issues. But also the complexity is also on the market side, let's say, because especially in ITC, there are much more stakeholders involved in the standardization, for example, with the Internet of Things and all the activity. Some stakeholders that before were not involved in digital standards, technological standards, and digital markets. So the complexity is increasing, and that's one of the sides that the new strategy is trying to tackle and should tackle. And Of course, this is just what is your views about it and about the strategy in general and the complexity that an association like yours should be have the real feeling of it.
So I was just saying, thanks for that. You framed it very well, and here I am to provide some of that diversity that you mentioned in the beginning of the panel. ITI is a global association of technology companies. We have existed for more than a century. We've been involved in standardization for a large part of the life of our organization. Now, this is not to say that I have been actually, like Stefan was saying, until a few years ago, I never would have probably dreamed of speaking in a panel on standardization. But I found out that it's actually very exciting, and clearly, as both Sophia and Cara have mentioned, there is a very strong component of, of geopolitics and strategic interest at play here. As an organization, we actually support the objectives of the European standardization strategy to strengthen Europe's leadership in this area. It is clear that standardization has played a crucial role in the establishment of Europe's single market and also in the success of its industry. The point is, from our perspective, the consolidation of these European strategic interests will be actually strengthened if European standardization processes are inclusive and they provide for broad stakeholder participation. So I'm going straight to the sort of the second part of the initial presentation. We clearly see that European leadership in international standard setting is enhanced when it represents cutting-edge ideas and cutting-edge technologies and innovation. Industry experts broadly need to be included in the standards process. We believe this is really crucial to ensure that standards also will align with the realities of the technology and the business. And this is where we stand, just to open up. I have 4 quick points that I'd like to make now, and I will not be able to cover all of the things that you hinted at the beginning, but I'm sure we will get there. And the first one is that our foundational stance here is that international, industry-driven, and voluntary standards are and have been for many years helping policymakers develop technical regulations, for example, to achieve interoperability, and they have offered a way to demonstrate compliance, to assess conformity, and to ensure safety and reliability of products. So when developing these standards, we need to keep in mind that they have an intrinsically global nature because these standards facilitate trade, they remove barriers, and they foster innovation. The second point, is very clear from what I said, is that we believe, again, that we need to ensure inclusiveness and openness in the standards development process in Europe, because European standardization needs to rely on the broader expertise that comes from involving international companies, their experts, and also their resources. I mean, Sophie was stressing how intensive and expensive it is to be engaged in standardization. And so that is also another element. If you look at the overall investment and engagement of international companies in Europe, this is also part of it. It's not only about jobs, obviously. That's very interesting. It's important. It's about R&D. But indeed, all this process, thousands of people are working on it, and a lot of them from international companies. I think the important element here is that what we see in the industry is that there is growing concern with this recent shift in the Commission's approach to standardization. We are seeing more restrictions on participation of non-EU experts, and we see how there is an increasing deviation from international standards. A couple of examples. If we look at the amendment of the standardization regulation 1025, and also the new rules on the selection of the radio equipment directive expert group, in both cases, participation of non-EU experts will be limited. I have the impression my microphone is stopping here and there. Thank you for that. The third example I wanted to make is about the Commission decision to establishing the high-level expert group on expert forum on European standardization. Here again, there is the possibility for the Commission to exclude non-European entities. We fully understand we're talking about critical and sensitive policy subject, but there are no criteria, there are no safeguards for to decide on exclusion aside from foreign control, which can even easily be defined as being subject to national law from a non-European country. So this is not a good or a bad thing in itself. So I think an important clarification that the industry is asking for is who might actually be excluded. Will all the third countries be deemed the same? Are we talking about UK, Japan, United States, Canada, alongside countries like China? And why should the European Union care? Because this forum, one of the functions of this forum is to coordinate the representation of European interests in international organizations. And this goal is great, and we believe would be best achieved if those who are part of these international standardization bodies can actually support it. And the last of my initial points is about the content. So far I've talked about elements that relate to the process of standardization development. There is no question that it is the quality of the expertise that has made the European Union a global leader here in the past. But restricting this participation solely based on the nationality will clearly lower the quality of the expertise available and will degrade the quality of the new standards. This is also going to lead to fragmentation and deviation from international standardization processes. We see the European Union is relying more and more on regional standards and on technical specifications. The IE Act is a case in point, but we also see it in other areas. And the final element is that this is a trend, and we notice it in other areas as well. When we look, for example, at cybersecurity, there is right now a scheme that is being developed by ENISA on certification for cloud services, which is called EUCS. And this illustrates the larger concern that the European Union is actually introducing exclusionary policies based on sovereignty-related concerns. This is all the more important because, as was said before, standardization in Europe is not only technical, it is an integral part of the European Union legal framework. So, I'll conclude here, but I think there are a number of concerns in terms of process and other concerns in terms of the content that these standards will be, we will be having in the future. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Guido. And we'll now give the floor to Michael Locke, who should be connected. Here he is. Hi, Michael, who is Associate General Counsel of GSMA. So representing GSMA, everybody knows, but representing the worldwide mobile community industry. And of course, you can give as well your perspective about from an association which includes a lot of different kind of stakeholders, and also just comment that, of course, standardization is interesting for not only for companies that want to dominate the market, but also for companies that want to participate in the market. Because of course, if you don't comply and you don't have a standard, you cannot compete in the market and participate in the market. So what is so it's very much broader interest. What is your views about the standardization strategy, a new standardization strategy of the European Union, and if there are any pitfalls or risks that you perceive?
First of all, I would like to say that, I mean, standardization, especially in telecoms, is like watching paint dry. And hence, its attractiveness is relatively limited. And that sort of belittles its importance, notably within the aspect of supply chain security and telecommunication. We talk a lot about the availability of natural resources, of human resources, or the infrastructure itself, or also the ability to manufacture, supply, operate. But what we don't look at in the same context is access to innovation, standardization, the protection of that innovation and its exploitation. And so what we're actually talking about when we talk about standardization, we look actually, at least in the telecoms area, who owns the technology within that standard. And how does that standard come about, given that the technology is owned by certain companies within geopolitical areas? So if you look at in telecommunications, and it is an odd area where standardization sort of created standard essential technology. And if you look at that, there's 50,000 roughly patent families in telecoms, of which around 15 or 14% are owned by one company. In China, there is a company in Korea, which is not far off. There is a company at 10% in the US, another in Korea, another in China. And that at number 6 and 7, we have 2 European companies. We have Nokia and Ericsson with respectively 8, 7%, and 5 to 6%. Now, what that also illustrates is that roughly 70%, 68, 70% of all standard and essential technology is owned by 7 companies. And that's rather shocking. That used to not be the case. I mean, the consolidation in the market has created a concentration of ownership of technology. The same applies actually to standardization. If you look who are the most prominent or the most prolific contributors to standards, once again, it's a Chinese company, the same one who is the biggest owner of standard essential patents. It's then followed by 2 European companies. It's Ericsson and Nokia. I mean, these are figures, they vary from time to time and people. But once again, 70% roughly of all contributions into the standards in telecommunications in release 17 and 18, 16, 17 and 18 are made by 7 companies. So you see a real concentration of almost the same companies that own the standards essential technologies and the ones that contribute to it. And that is disconcerting. And that also begs certain questions. What kind of reforms would you like to introduce in order to sort of readdress the balance? Now, this standard essential technology, of course, is being licensed. It's going to be commercialized. And that shows you another rather important aspect, why one can't just tinker around with it, because it could jeopardize very much the livelihood of certain companies. When you look at Huawei, for example, they're making 100 billion a year. They make roughly 20 billion in R&D. Their licensing revenue is virtually nothing. I don't think it's even $1 billion. When you look at companies like Qualcomm, they make only a third of the money, around 33 billion, 32 billion. Their profits are 27%. Their licensing revenue is 19%. Their R&D is 20%. The same applies to Nokia. Nokia is around at 25, 26, 27 billion. Profits are 18%, 12 or 70%. And that's the same what they make in licensing revenues. So there's a direct correlation between certain companies, between the profits they make from standard essential technology and what they are actually generating in general in profit. So these always vary, and the figures, this is one of the problems we have in this particular area. It's not transparent. So it's self-declaration. People just declare that technology is essential to a particular standard. And that is one of the areas where we at least would welcome much greater clarity. So when we look at the areas that the Commission would like to focus on, for example, that the prioritization aspect to improve the governance and integrity, or also to see that investing in these innovation projects I think the industry needs help. I mean, in 15 years, we've gone from 15, 16 providers with substantial standard essential technology to literally 7 companies who run the roost. Probably even less if you discount some, the largest 5 or 4 would almost add up 50%. So, I mean, the buzzword really here is transparency. How can the Commission in particular create an environment where it's very clear who actually introduces new standards essential technology, who creates the standards, who would like to invest in which particular area? And the biggest problem here is when the current assessment of who does what, there are simple approximations. Sometimes it's just inference. Well, this technology can be standard essential because the people attend the standards meeting. I don't think we haven't made much progress in the last 15 years to clarify this. I mean, it goes down to the long-standing discussion in ETSI. What do you declare your standard essential technology to? You declare to the whole standard, or can you not declare to a subsection? The same applies to when you look, I mean, the European Commission, as we said, it would be very helpful to really focus one's attention on standards. But what you can't, of course, do is sort of start bifurcating it. We here in the UK, the creation of UK-focused standards, the same in China, and we know how that worked out in India. So, I mean, it needs to be a global effort, simply based on the fact who owns the technology. So one thing that would be probably helpful would be having a focus on who does what where in the standards, and maybe bundle efforts or coordinate European efforts. The other one would be to have a uniform assessment on essentiality so that we know who owns what technology in the standard. I hope that sort of gives you a flavor from our perspective, how we see standardization in telecoms.
Of course, it's very interesting. You a bit anticipated the topic of the next panel, talking about the standard essential patents. But of course, it's all these subjects are very much interconnected. And of course, one of the issue is that of course the strategy, standardization strategy, so the also high-level principles should be implemented in a coherent way, also at operative level. With the amendment of the standardization regulation, but also in a coordinated fashion with forthcoming, for example, SEP regulation that DG GROW is dealing with the moment. I'm not sure when it's supposed to come, but maybe it's scheduled for the end of the year or something like that. And of course, it's all everything very interconnected and relevant, and also with the technological sovereignty, technological leadership that the European Union wants to take. In some areas, of course, it's necessary investment for standardization in human resource capability, in building, R&D, also intellectual property rights, because to give the possibility to invest in research and development, and of course the coordination and the definition of more transparency in the process, in the governance, and also streamlining the complexity of the governance of the standard definition organization is something which is important. And I will start with a very quick second round, and then we'll give some time to the floor for question and answer. But if you have, Sophie, if you want, you have some reaction to what you heard from the other panelists.
We'll put this on. Is that, you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So first of all, very quickly, just a reaction on the last intervention. Indeed, we have actually a second panel, but also there is an upcoming initiative on standard essential patents. There was just a call for evidence. We're working on an impact assessment. So all the issues raised are being looked at by the colleagues who are actually also IPR experts. So we work closely together, but I would leave this more to the next panel. Then I heard now at the end, and also what the colleague from, or the representative from ITI said, not suffocating standards, global efforts, et cetera, et cetera. I want to start maybe with that, with the international. So absolutely, if we can, we will always go internationally, because I think the EU has made very, very many conscious statements that we believe in free trade. But I also want to cite my commissioner, yes, open, yes, free trade, yes, but let's not be naive. And let's not close our eyes to certain realities which are unfortunately happening. And I mean, I have just been with my Director General 10 days ago to Geneva, because obviously ISO, IC, ITU, etc. are hugely important. And issues like inclusiveness, we want to see in ISO and IAC and ITU. We are not even members ourselves. Huh? We also have to ask for liaison status and so on. So I think if we want to work internationally, there are some screws to be adjusted. We will keep the dialogue. We're also working with ISO and IC in a task force to ensure more compliance between international and harmonized European standards. Because of course, we are very well aware, if we have very, very good international standards, everybody benefits from it. But let's also face or be realistic that we in the European Union, we have put legislation forward, which is very ambitious, because we want to be global leaders on the green transition and on the digital transition. Now, what does this mean? Green transition, I mean, I will just mention the Sustainable Product Initiative, where we will work with standards to really have sustainability in the manufacturing process already. We look at the digital agenda. I think if we look at the Data Act, if we look at the DSM, the DMA, the AI Act with a human-centric approach, now the Cyber Resilience Act, I think one word here is fundamental rights. Now, if we look internationally, international standards cannot be the minimal compromise. They need to be of top quality. And I just yesterday had a meeting with raw materials colleagues and the national standardization bodies. I can tell you, on sustainable sourcing, on sustainable mining, a TC that is not chaired by a European NSB, also not by an American NSB, I will not name it, you don't even find the word sustainable in the standard. So, yes, international, if it's up to our own values, interests, and, to use the word in a double sense, standards. So, yes, we want to work internationally, but we will not compromise. And this is why our objective is, let's work internationally, let's bring the best experts, but we need to have that fallback option of, you know, most likely having to work also European and be ambitious and well set up. Now, I have heard 2 or 3 points on the legal amendment and that we're closing ourselves up, etc. And you have used the word participation, broad expertise. Absolutely. We are not closing with a legal amendment any participation in the European standardization processes. It is about the decision making. Now, it is limited and safeguarded to standardization requests or mandates that are issued by the European Commission in support of our policies and our law. Now, this can be the AI Act. This can be raw materials in the Future Act. This can be other issues where we have very high requirements. The essential requirements are quite specific. And here we give the decision-making power to the national standardization bodies. The national standardization bodies of the European Union and the EEA. And frankly, if it is, as the court said, a harmonized European standard, quasi EU law, we believe that the decision-making should be in the hands of EU stakeholders. This is all. Now, the national standardization bodies have open consultations, participation. Austrian standardization body works with 4,500 stakeholders. 100%, these are not only Europeans. And I can tell you that, and I know that a lot of non-European companies are currently investing in national standardization bodies. DIN is working with 45,000 stakeholders. We are not closing ourselves. And the same in Etsy. We're not going to tell Etsy you can't have Apple or Samsung or Huawei or whoever on the technical committees. I mean, who are we to say that? No. But the key decisions on whether to accept a standard, whether to introduce a new work item, or to finally agree on a deliverable, we want in the hands of the NSBs. Now, this is the first point. Decision-making, not participation. The second point that was made on the Radio Equipment Directive, yes, because the Radio Equipment Directive is deciding on how to implement legislation, and in particular on cybersecurity. And there, yes, we are becoming more restrictive because it is about EU legislation, and I think stakeholders will understand that there we want to, if it's really about very sensitive topics, it's about discussing with the EU stakeholders, because we had situations, unfortunately, where some companies were in the room that were not defending EU interests. And then the last point on the high-level forum, yes, we have just published the decision to set it up. It is a forum on EU standardization. And yes, we have built in a discretion that we can make that decision to restrict participation. It doesn't mean that we necessarily will, but if it is about specific applications or topics or whatever, it will be in our discretion. Other than that, I think it's okay, but I just wanted to clear that a little bit because I've heard it a lot, and we're not shutting down or closing it down, our European standardizations.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you very much. Chiara, do you want to have a second, quick second round?
Yes. Yes.
No.
Yes.
Take that one.
Yes.
Good.
Super. Thank you very much. We fully. Yes? Apologies. Apologies for also the people online. Yes? Super. Apologies again. We fully support the European Commission and what Sophie just mentioned. About international standardization, we even have a little bit of a more critical position because ISO, SC, and ITU are not organizations taking decision by themselves. They are based on their members. Their members are the national standardization bodies. So I come back to my critical point on the level of decision-making that the standardization bodies have. Is the national level the right one for global markets? I wonder. And then I have a question for Guido. Now, Guido, you mentioned, you represent, I had a look at your companies. You have all kinds of companies. You have some American and some Chinese companies in your membership, only American companies.
We have global companies, but no Chinese companies.
Okay, Korean companies. Yeah, okay, good. So, well, that's very interesting. That's a very interesting statement. Anyhow, so when an international company with a European origin is going to the US or is going to Korea, is there a reciprocity of access in terms of expert groups of the Commission, standardization, in the same way as for those companies here in Europe?
Can I go straight to this? So that would depend on the country in question, but the fundamental difference is the nature of European standardization, which is essentially an extension of European legislation and potentially might lead to exclusion from the European market if you do not comply with a certain standard. And so the moment you deviate from international standards, that become a trade barrier. Now, Sophie was referring to fundamental rights, and we fully agree with that. I think the nuance is that when we use a general reference to non-EU entities, that is a very blunt definition to decide whether one is pro-fundamental rights or against fundamental rights. You explained how the Commission vision in the standardization strategy, and the fact that, of course, you will always look first at international standards, but then if there is not one that is suitable, the fallback option will be. I think what's really important there is that that fallback option does not become the default option. And from our industry perspective, the better way to see that is prioritize, invest in the development of international standards so that they become the ones that can actually be used to comply and support European legislation. And that can be done. Otherwise, the net result, again, would be international stakeholders excluded from the European standardization process. That leads to standards that are lower quality and leads to fragmentation of standardization.
Thank you. Maybe
just a point, and Sophie, I think you are going to say basically the same. Speaking about the US standards and US association system, we are not aware of many international standards used by the US. They have a lot of national standards, and they are not considered barriers to trade, as far as I know.
And you're right that the US government should do that, but we're not the US government.
But you're representing European and international companies with US interest as well. And you are complaining that the US companies are not active, no?
I think the private industry interest is not a US interest.
Uh-huh.
No, just 2 points. Harmonized European standards are actually still voluntary. They're not mandatory. So the beauty of a harmonized standard is that it gives you presumption of conformity across the 27 EU and most 3 EA markets. This is the beauty of our internal market. But if a company doesn't want to comply, they can go through 27 conformity assessment bodies. Contrary to the US, where when the US government decides to publish a standard in the law, it is mandatory. And there, the US government actually can decide themselves how they want to change a standard or not. And then if I just want to give 2 last figures on international, if we look at the catalog between IEC and CENELEC standards, we are at 76%. There's no catalog comparable in the world. And if we look at the CEN and ISO standards, we are at 45%. So there, again, the biggest convergence in the world in terms of how many standards internationally are the same in the EU. We can do much better. We would love to have 100%. But as I said, not at the costs of the compatibility with our law. I mean, it always has to be compatible with EU law.
And I think nobody questions that. And we represent companies from Germany, France, United States, Japan, South Korea. I'm not here to defend United States government policies. Let's organize a panel on US standardization policy and we can discuss that. That is not the point here. And the European Union is rightly concerned about state-driven standardization approaches in other jurisdictions. Should not fall into the same trap.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. And so I give the floor to Michael Locke for a quick second round, if you want to react to what you have heard. And then we'll open the floor just for a couple of questions or statements from the audience. Michael?
Yeah, I would say that we welcome that the Commission in particular is taking a greater interest in standards. However, the buzzword, once again, is participation. There's not enough standards experts, for example, in the telecommunications industry in Europe to actually make up the numbers to match those that are represented from other regions. And that means certain tasks need to be shared. I mean, there have been discussion in the telecommunications industry, particularly between the mobile network operators. How do we actually make an impact on standards? These are the end users, basically, of the technology in telecommunications. But their role has over time diminished to the point where I presume that the largest contributor in standards from the telecommunications mobile operators is NTT with 3%. And I think Deutsche Telekom, which has a fairly large standards department compared to others, is 1%. The same actually applies to Apple, oddly. So you have the Huawei's with 18%, the Samsungs with 14%. So this is the problem. We need to find a way to encourage companies to actually participate in standardization, international standardizations from Europe, to actually have a foothold in international standardization. And that's not quite happening. And there would be a lot of encouragement would be needed from the Commission to make that happen. Also coordination maybe. But that we're not looking at government intervention. What we're looking at is the encouragement for companies to make it for them profitable actually to be involved in standardization. So that's probably my final words on that particular topic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael. So now we are going to an end to our panel. I would like to ask the audience if there are some questions or remarks. Someone want to, please? You just, you will receive a micro and introduce yourself so everybody can know.
Does it work? Yes.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for all interventions. Yeah. I'm Marco Di Morfetta from the Secretariat of the Council. I have, well, I don't know if it is a question, but I will play the game of European institutions in the sense that, of course, we can account for a level playing field of favorable for companies for European companies for the standardization, but I have thought about this statistic. 70% of standards come from 7 companies, and I was wondering if these 7 companies managed somehow to take advantage of the standardization system, or managed to influence somehow the standards, or it is just simply because these 7 companies have the knowledge that other companies don't have. So the big question is how to encourage not only experts having a certain level of skills for producing standards, but also how to encourage companies being big enough to compete with those 7 companies, for instance. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. We could collect another question or another statement, please. Wait for the mic. Please.
My name is Henk de Vries, Professor of Standardization Management, Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University. We see in the presentations, but also in the strategy itself, an inherent tension between power play and European values. And I think that the focus on power play undermines the tension, the values, but as a result, this will undermine the power position, because then the country model is at stake. We see now a fortress Europe, and this was never the case in the international scene. And this is visible already at the sea level, where European standards bodies try to avoid China to play a role that it simply is able to have as a developed nation. And so I think it's going in the wrong direction, and the solution would be something else, particularly in terms of relating to the societal challenges to values, and to expertise. Secretariats only for people with the right expertise. The system is in decline, also due to too much intervention by the European Commission. We should reinvent the European system.
Okay, thank you very much. We want to answer to the question, maybe Sophie? Yes.
I can just give two quick reactions. On the first, I mean, this is really the specific case of standard essential patents, and it comes down to IPR. Who has invested in the IPR, who has invested in the technology, who has filed the patents, and who is then able to link the standard to the patent, which is then again the process within some standardization organizations. And then if you want to get the standard, you need to buy the patent. And there we have, I mean, it comes very simply to that. Have our companies invested enough in the RD&I? And how are they positioned in the global marketplace? And how fair overall is that game is another question, of course. I would just have one question to the professor, because I don't think it's about a power play or EU values. I just want to ask you, do you want an open, transparent, and accessible internet, for example? So that comes down to internet protocols. And if you have seen what is happening on internet protocols, if we wouldn't put down our foot on EU values, all our internet would not be free and accessible, and your data would not be protected. The same on facial recognition. A standard on facial recognition, what are we going to do with the biometric data? The same if we talk about positive, negative, discriminatory selection of AI. A worker who's female, 30, 35, possibly being pregnant in a selection process. How do we want that AI technology to work? Do we want to link it to our fundamental rights? I think so. This is a question we have to pose ourselves. Not whether we want to cooperate with China, North Korea, South Korea, US, Africa. Frankly, I don't care. I care about the outcome of the standard. And this is what we're talking about, right? It's not about you know, abstract ideas. It's about very concrete things. And this is why we are more assertive globally.
But if these things are so important, shouldn't they be regulated instead of being left to standards? These are issues that are crucial, but yes, they need to be covered by European legislation. They yes, cannot be left to standardization.
Yes.
Standardization, if there is a problem, again, and that's a separate story, I think, you know, we think it would be much better to really make sure that the international standardization development process gets to the right outcomes, and the European Union, who other than the European Union can play that role in international standardization bodies, instead of just saying, we don't like what's going on internationally, let's do our own stuff. I'm oversimplifying,
yeah,
but
yeah.
this
no,
sounds
but you're
like
right.
what
but
is
it is a very valid point, by the way, and I think this is something that Chiara just raised with us
yes,
yesterday.
Guido, I agree with you. I agree with you. I think we need to find a right way to distinguish the role of legislation and its complementarity with standards, with harmonized standards. We already have quite a lot of hints from the Court of Justice, and we are getting there. But indeed, we need to have more separation about what standards can do and what standards can't do. And can't do is because of both the how they are produced and by whom they are also produced. So the process and the content. And I think that this is also going to be part of the essential strategy in terms of discussions.
Yes, and I mean, if you look at the Cyber Resilience Act from the you see a differentiation already. If you look at other recent proposals, but also, I mean, this is a topic that normally trade associations don't like at all, but why do we have a systemic introduction of the fallback option of the Commission to adopt technical specifications, common specifications, I want to correct myself. Because we need to have that safeguard net and that safety net that if the standards are not in compliance, that we need to regulate. But it is another panel.
Another panel, but it's, yeah. it's good to end with a final point of agreement. Don't know if, Michael, you wanted to say something?
I don't want to diminish because it was such a perfect ending. There's just one point. International standards and the impact, it really comes down to investment in R&D. There is no direct correlation between how many patents you file or what you put into the standards, because there is no transparency, there is no verification system. And I know the Commission is working on it. That's one aspect. The other aspect is it's fine to standardize, but if it's not European companies that bring in the technology, you're still dependent on foreign companies to provide the technology for your standards. And that might be an area where Europe needs to look into how can we bundle our efforts and make a greater input in various strategic technology areas. That, and within this international standard, of course. And that's slightly different probably. And excluding people from participating in a standard which hasn't in various areas, not necessarily in Europe, it is counterproductive, because ultimately who own the technology when it's standardized by someone else, they still own the technology and you have to use it. So for that reason, I mean, a more coordinated effort in that respect would be most appreciated.
Thank you. Yeah, no, it's good to end with the final point of agreement, and also we open the floor to the next panel. And I would like to thank again Sophie, Chiara, Guido, and Michael for their availability and their very interesting intervention and interactions between them. So now I give the floor to Giuseppe Colangelo for moderating the next panel, or all the panelists. Please.
Alive after 30 minutes. You have an easy solution, as we already know, probably even before the first panel. Okay. If you pick up a topic such as standards, you are pretty sure that after 30 minutes, everyone is still awake. Probably the other second topic is to find a way to keep telcos and digital platform in the same room. Okay, so again, that will be another chance to do not have significant effort to promote a lively debate. It's a great pleasure to moderate this second panel that, let's say, keep together the role of standardization within innovation, competitiveness, IoT, and another topic where it's pretty difficult to find a common view in order to tackle the issue that is standard essential patents. And we will benefit in our discussion from the contribution of a great lineup of speakers. Just a few words to set the scene as a background. If we would like to find a keyword that connects standards, innovation, and IoT, probably I would pick up a word such as interoperability. I mean that from a broader view, if you look at the recent and ongoing regulatory intervention in digital markets, and I'm thinking to the Digital Market Act, but probably mainly to the Data Act proposal. We know that European Union, and not just European Union, is going to find a way to promote interoperability in order to allow the interconnection through different devices, the sharing of data. It's something that probably we need to address also with new kind of tools such as electric vehicles and so on and so forth. And then standard play a key role. Then when we move to another perspective and we think about the standard essential patents, we are still struggling to find to have a common understanding of their economic meaning and their legal implication. But we know and we are aware of the fact that they are at the center of significant changes in Europe and EU. in US and EU. Because when it comes to US, we know that recently the new US administration has promoted a significant shift when it comes to the remedies for friend encumbered SEPs. We know that the European Commission is expected to deliver a legislative initiative to enhance SEP enforcement and licensing. In the UK has been recently released the outcome of the consultation promoted by UK government to see how to ensure that SEP ecosystem is functioning effectively. And the rise of IoT, let's say, has added additional layer of complexity when it comes to SEP licensing. First of all, we know that one of the hotly debated topic is about friend commitment is the level of value chain, whether the SEP holder is free to choose the level of value chain, or whether there is a need to ensure the access to also to at component level. And finally, when it comes to geopolitics, we know that there is a strategic way in which the anti-suit injunction has been undertaken and promoted by some company, and due to the fact that apparently some cards are eager to grant such order to impede the possibility to enforce and promote proceedings in foreign country. We know that the EU has recently filed a case against China at the WTO, complaining about the potential unfair practice by Chinese company supported by Chinese cards and Chinese government in undermining the value of European and I would say also US standard essential patent. That, as a background, this is pretty enough to understand that we are living in challenging times, and fortunately we have amazing speaker that will help us to surf the waves. They then definitely do not need an introduction, but let's respect the rules. So let me introduce them. I will start with Emilio Davila Gonzalez, at least as a matter of proximity, because he's next to me. He is the head of sector ICT standardization at DG Connect at the European Commission. On the other side of the proximity feature, we have Urska Petrovic that is connected online. And Urska is Director of Economic Strategy at Qualcomm. Then we have Marit Palovirta, Senior Director at Regulatory Affairs at European Telecommunication Network Operators Association. And finally, we have Patrick Hopkins, Director of IPR Policy at Ericsson. I will start with Emilio, please. And just not a technical advice. They told me that we should not switch on and switch off the microphone. We just have to leave them at their default setting because apparently they work. Okay.
Okay, let's check it. No, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be an audience, not only through the screen, but really over there in these days. So to the topic, that we have seen the importance of standards already in the previous panel, and you have mentioned again, it's crucial for the single market. But what you say, and in particular for digital or ICT standards, interoperability is key, and standards provide for interoperability. And we need systems that can communicate to each other, and in particular in the EU, where we have 27 member states, plus the 3EA, but not only that, because we are talking about a global market, so we have seen the importance, in particular in connectivity, mobile phones, of interoperability. But they also provide safety and security, which is possibly very much liked by the consumers, and this is important because they generate trust in consumers, but they also open new markets, and this is important for also the European companies, and they promote innovation. I mean, do not reinvent the wheel. We have seen that in many of our EU funding research projects. So why are you going to reinvent the wheel if you have already something on a standard, which is a standardized technology, state of the art, and you could build more innovation on top of it. And another important aspect is avoiding lock-in. So you are a public authority, you need to make public procurement, you better get into a standard that any possibly suppliers and their SMEs is important for them can implement and provide you a service rather to be located to a big company that then will decide what to do and how to ensure the maintenance on next generation of the standards. So it's important to have the standards, and the standards should be open and accessible to everyone. Okay, you may need to pay a fee, or you may need to pay some patents, some royalties for the licenses, but in practice they should be open and accessible to any implementer that would like to develop a system, a product, a service, an application based on that standards. So, message, we need the standards rather than the proprietary technologies. We have seen in many occasions in the past, and in particular in the IT, when you have a proprietary technology, then difficult to develop something else, in particular if you get market power there. And how do you make the standards? And this has been also discussed, experts. Namely from the industry, not only because, for instance, the voice of the consumers is really important, in particular when you develop standards that have some societal component, but also public administrations, they are users of the standards, and they need to be there to ensure that the regulations are complied. But industry is key. I mean, standardization is made on a voluntary basis, and we need to develop and to ensure that the experts are participating. And by the way, I would like to say, because this was requested, and this is fundamental in the strategy, we are already funding a lot of research and innovation. For instance, hundreds of millions in the development of 5G technologies, trying to bring together experts and mobilizing to them to international and global standardizations, or creating this PPP, the 5G PPP, and supporting the creation of the Alliance of Internet of Things Innovation, not only in Europe, but also with global partners in order to support the development of global standards. But coming back to the point of the panel, how to make this sustainable standardization system that can attract contributors. And there are different business models. We have many different SDOs, sorry for the acronyms, this is very standard development organization in the world. In the ICT, you have the formal ones that we have been talking about, Senelec, ETSI, ISO, IEC, ITU, but we have many others. We have the global partnership like 3GPP that makes the connectivity standard. We have the 1M2M that promote IoT standards. They are also done in ISO or in other places, but 1M2M is also developing the platforms for IoT standards. You have IEEE, you have W3C for web, you have IETF for internet standards. You have many of them. And they have different business models. In some cases, people participate because they have interest or have a common standard that could help them to develop the products. That W3C is an example of that. Then you have a royalty-free policy, fine. In other cases where you have to invest a lot on research and innovation, then you may need to have some incentive to contribute to the standards and having some return on your investment. And important, not only on the research and innovation, but even in the participation on standardization, because that's a lot of resources. I mean, if you look at the release 15 of 3GPP, I think they had more than 100,000 contributions. So if you want to be there and you need to send experts, and again, from Europe, we need to ensure that we have the right expert skilled and that we support that they participate in international standardization, defending EU values and interests. But they need this research and incentive. So how do we balance the issue of standards being open and implementable by anybody and incentives to contributions? Well, this is the famous FRAND, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory licensing commitment. So if you bring a contribution to the standards, and we want the best contributions that are brought to the standards, then the one that contributes should commit that they will license their patent technology, their patented technologies or patented contribution into the standard to a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory way. This allows access to any partner, and at the same time, it provides incentives to cover the investment in research and standardization. But of course, FRAND, by definition, and it should be like that, you cannot define, okay, this is FRAND, this means $3 of royalties or whatever, plus more licensing terms. No, there is no one size fits all solutions. And this is where you have the tensions. Also because of the FRAND nature. So you may have cases of hold up. So those that have the patents incorporated into the standards that have global penetrations, then if you want to implement that standard, you are infringing those patents, you have to pay license for them. If they abuse from that, then there may be some hold-up solutions, and then the implementers may not be able to cope with that. Or, but there is also the other dimension, the hold-out. And standard essential patents are patents like any other IPR, but they have a specific regime. For instance, if you want to introduce a product in the market that is covered by a patent and you infringe that patent and you don't get a license, immediately this is retired. This is not the case in the case of standards. If you want to implement a standard, then you put the standards, the product that complies with the standard into the market, and then somebody, the stakeholder, will knock at your door and say, hey, you have infringed my patents, which are essential to the standard, you have to pay for it, and then you enter into a negotiation, and then that will be it. And only if you are an unwilling licensor or licensee, then you may be suffering injunctions and your product be retired. If you are unwilling licensee, if you are an unwilling licensor, then you may run into some competition problems. So, as we believe that we need a sustainable standardization system, from the Commission we have been trying to, and by the way, the background document, I like it a lot, but maybe you forgot two communications there. One on the ICT standardization priorities from 2016 that came with the standardization package, and the other of 2017 setting the EU vision on standard essential patents. And there you will find many of the things that Michael was saying before. So we want to have this balanced, sustainable system, provided a level playing field and increasing transparency in the declaration of the patents, not only in HC 3GPP where there are, but in most of the SDOs that are developing standards that may have patents that then the patent holders, the SEP holders would like to assert. So there is a need to increase transparency. There is a need to develop a more smooth licensing. We see that because of these tensions, there is still a lot of litigations. And we have seen last one in the automotive sector. There were some litigations, very famous. Let's try to provide then some explanation of both the licensing process, how to improve it, and the meaning of FRAND. And we had already a big landmark with the Huawei versus Citi decision of the Court of Justice that honestly I think brought a lot of interested hints how to behave on two sides, and then bring more certainty into the whole systems. So if I'm an implementer of a new Internet of Things, I know what can be expected. And vice versa, if I am an SME and we want more SMEs to be brought into the standardization, I know that also if I contribute to the technology, it's easier for me to get some revenues from the technology I'm contributing. And this is where we are working now, as Sophie has explained. In particular, colleagues from GROW are now in the process of making the impact assessment, because we want not to include too much burden in one side or to the other, but have a balanced, sustainable system. And this is where we're working on. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Emilio. I would have several things to say about hold up, hold out, and so on and so forth, but I'm pretty sure we probably have space in the second round and the Q&A session. I would like just Urska to jump in and to verify where, okay, we see you.
Great.
Please.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for having me here. It has been so far a very interesting discussion, so I'm very glad to be part of this. So given the physical distance between us, I thought it would be helpful to maybe have a presentation to help the audience visualize a little bit the data that I will talk about. And you know, what I will say is nothing new. We have already heard many of these things today, but perhaps I will try to connect the dots and try to present a cohesive picture of this discussion. So we can start with the presentation. I'm just checking if you can see the presentation or you can't. I understand that someone on your end will be great.
Yeah, we are seeing it.
Okay, excellent. Let's go back to the first slide. No, let's go back. That is going forward. Okay, great. So first slide here. Next one. Excellent. Okay, so we talk about technology standards. So I see very often there is some confusions when we talk about technological standards. So I thought, let's first clarify what are we talking about? What are technological standards? And we can distinguish three very big groups of standards. First are government mandated standards. These are rules set by an agency that require that product and services meet a specific standard, that meet specific requirements. These standards are very often related to product safety, environment, and so on. As the name says, compliance with these standards is mandated by the law. Then we have de facto standards. These are standards that are developed by a single company that generally has sufficient market power to persuade the market to adopt its own solution. Compliance with these standards is voluntary, but in practice, the majority of the market uses this standard. Classical example of such standard is the Windows operating system. And then we have a third category, which are industry-led standards, which are standards developed by a group of industry participants. So engineers from various companies come together to address specific technical solutions and develop a standard. Compliance with the standard is also voluntary, and such standards may or may not be successful. Sometimes you develop a standard that is successful, sometimes you do not. The standard simply doesn't get adopted. And a great example of these standards are cellular standards, so 3G, 4G, 5G. Now, to be sure, this distinction between these three standards is not always clear, is blurred. In the US, for example, we know that sometimes government agencies refer to standards developed by the industry, and compliance then becomes compulsory. We have heard earlier that, sometimes even standards set by the government are not compulsory. You just get some favorable condition. But for the purpose of this discussion, I think it's very important to keep the distinction between these three types of standards. So next slide. I will focus on the third category, so industry-led technological standards. These are standards that are developed through an open, consensus-based and industry-led standards. What does this mean? Open, it means that the process for developing a standard is open to a variety of stakeholders, not only companies that want to contribute their technologies to the standards, but also implementers, consumers group, industry representation, academia, government, perhaps. So it is open, anyone can participate. Consensus-based is basically how decisions are made based on consensus, and industry-led, the industry basically leads the entire process. As mentioned before, these standards are voluntary in the sense that both the creation and the implementation of the standards is left to the market. So whoever wants to participate and adopt the standard can do it. And we have seen that particularly in some sectors, such as the cellular and the Wi-Fi space, these standards have been widely successful. You have here, for example, a few data about cellular connectivity. We have today 11 billion IoT connections in the world, and we have over 7 billion phone users. And I know Patrick is in the room. I will steal what I have learned from him, but he once presented this data in a bigger picture, and he said, think about it. Cellular connectivity is available to more people than running water and electricity are. So it's a widely spread technology. But to achieve this success with voluntary standard, there is a need to really carefully balance the interest of everyone in the ecosystem. Because if people are not happy with how the system works, they will leave. They will leave, and we will live in a bifurcated world where we no longer have one standard across the globe, but we have different standards. Okay, so next slide. So why does this matter? We have had these standards around for many years. So what is new? What has changed? Well, what has changed is the geopolitical aspect of it. We have seen that countries around the globe have recognized that technological standards and leadership in technological standards matters, not only for economic prosperity, but also for other goals that we mentioned earlier, such as tech sovereignty. It matters for sustainability, it matters for human rights. And you can see here an article from the Wall Street Journal. It's actually, it was published a few years ago. And it says, whoever will control the standards for some key technological areas will be able to control the world. And they talk about AI, telecommunication. And now someone might say, well, this is a little bit alarmist. But the fact is that we have come to the recognition that, these standards matter and matter for our everyday life. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. And so in response to this, we have indeed seen that major countries in the world have started adopting some form of policy to strengthen their ability to influence the development of these global standards. We have, of course, seen China with the adoption of the China Standards 23 plan. We have seen the European Union with the adoption of the EU standardization strategy, and we have seen similar development in the United States. Next slide, please. And we have seen actually that some of these policies are already having very important results. Here we have the example of the 3GPP, which is the organization that is best known for the work that it does in the 3G, 4G, and 5G standards. And as you can see, the membership in the 3G has increased over time, and it has increased in particularly from some countries like China. Now, I know this is not the best graph, but basically, Chinese companies now represent 20% of the members of the 3GPP. For context, North America, 25%, Europe, 25%. So it's not that China has the largest percentage, but they have become an important member of the 3GPP. Another important data is that China has increased the participation in the 3GPP and leadership position. I believe that between 2018 and 2020, the number of leadership positions held by Chinese companies has increased by 40%. So what does that show? That actually the policy that have been adopted in China are working. I'm not saying that China is in any way leading this, but it has certainly become an important player in developing global technological standards. So this has raised the question in other countries, okay, what should we do? Indeed, in the European Union, the question is, what can we do to ensure that our own companies or that the European Union more generally is able to be an important player when it comes to global standards? So next slide. So the question is, what are the right policy pillars to promote competitive leadership in technological standards? What are those policy pillars that will stimulate and encourage the development of an innovative ecosystem, but that benefits everyone? And here we list 3 policy pillars, and we have frankly addressed all of these 3 today, although a little bit not all together. We have discussed them here and there, but basically there are 3 important policy pillars. First is maintain global standards, so avoid bifurcation. Second is focus on the rules of the standardization process. And third, encourage investment in R&D. And now I will be briefly touching upon each of these policy pillars. So the next slide. So the first important policy pillars is maintain global standards. And so we have seen that, in reaction to this increased participation by China and other countries, we have seen some suggestions that, okay, let's bifurcate. Let's develop US only standard. Let's develop EU standards. Let's move away from these global standards. And that would be a profound mistake. And the reason is because these global standards have been and are a catalyst for innovation that has generated incredible economic growth and has benefited consumers worldwide through better products, but also cheaper products. You see here the data that cellular technology has already enabled an incredible economic growth. The smartphone industry was one of the fastest growing industry ever. But here you see that, with the deployment of 5G across different industry verticals, it is expected that by 2035, 5G will generate 13 trillion in enabled revenue across 16 industries. And this is possible mainly because of two reasons. One is because the innovation that you can get when you have a global brain power, it's very different from the innovation that you can get when there is only one company or only one country or a region working together. So it's really the collective brain power. And the second is the scale. In this sector, scale really matters. And when you have access to a global market, you really have the scale needed to make the necessary investment in R&D. If you don't have this scale, then you cannot make so much investments in R&D. So maintaining global standards is important. And we know we heard in the earlier panel, yeah, sure, global standard, but if they comply with certain requirement. And that's absolutely true. We need to make sure that they comply with a certain requirement. Regulation can play an important role, but we should not forget that these global standards, they have been so widely adopted without any compulsory nature. So one way is certainly making sure, through legislation that they adhere to certain standards. But for the European Union, it's also important to ensure that we have European companies that can participate at the table and they can ensure within the standardization process that they adhere to the European values, so they promote European values. So global standards are important. Let's not go back to the bifurcated word. Next slide. So if bifurcation is not a solution, then what should we do? What can be done? And here it's where, the rules of the game are important. It's very important to ensure that the standardization process is open, there is a balance of interest, there is a due process, appeal process, and consensus. And this rule-based ecosystem is important for two reasons. On one hand, it avoids gamemanship. It avoids or mitigates against the risk that a single company or a group of company or even a region obtains undue influence within the SDO. So in a way, these rules ensure that everyone is playing a fair game. At the same time, through this rule-based ecosystem, we ensure that companies have the incentives to participate and adhere to the standard. If the rules are not fair to everyone, let's say if we say, let's exclude China from the standardization system, what will happen? Well, they will just exit, will not adhere to the standard, and they will develop their own standard. So again, we're in a bifurcated world, which we know is not the good outcome for the society. So fair rules of the game are both to avoid gamesmanship, but also to encourage participation, because everyone feels that the rules of the game are fair and not distorted. And next slide. And the third policy pillars is maintaining strong incentives for R&D. When it comes to the cellular industry, research has shown that the investment that companies that operate in the cellular industry make a higher investment percentage-wise of their revenue in R&D than any other industry except for biotech. So these investments are massive. So we need to encourage companies to make these investments so that they can go to the standardization process and they can contribute and so become technological leaders. And the standardization strategy acknowledges that and has a few suggestions on how to do that. In my view, however, it misses one important point, and that is that in any market-based economy, the most powerful tools we have to encourage investment in R&D is the IPR system, because this is what allows companies to make risk investment in R&D, and when they are successful, to monetize those investments. And without that, without a reliable IPR system, companies cannot make this R&D investment, cannot develop the technologies, and they can therefore not compete to be a technological leader. So without that, European Union will basically become a technological user rather than a technological leader. So again, three policy pillars: maintain global standard, focus on the rules of the game, and encourage investments in R&D. Thank you.
Jurska. Marit, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll try to be very concise and brief, and just mainly building on the discussions that we've already heard, and maybe coming up with some reactive comments from our side. But before that, so very briefly, I'm representing ETNO. ETNO is the European Telecommunication and Network Operators Association, and I think it's important in this context to say who are our members. So it is the 31 largest telecom operators in the EU from the different member states. And well, standardization is of course a very key issue for us when we think about the things that our members are currently working on, which are 5G and all the connectivity ecosystem that will help us hopefully then achieve the digital green transition goals that our politicians and policymakers have set for us, and I guess we are also fully endorsing those. So in this context, very briefly, we fully welcome the reinforced EU standardization effort, and that includes the standards themselves, but also then having a relook potentially at the standardization system as it is today. So we as ETNO, we are active member in some of these platforms. ITU, CPT, ETSI, many of our members, of course, go actively to the global fora, IETF, 3GPP, etc., etc. But going back to the point of resources and skills, the reality is that there is a gap. So we are also seeing very much that neither us as an association nor our members really have the resources to fully focus and follow these standards, whether it's at the European bodies or globally. So fully endorsing the effort on that side to also have a look at it on how we could mend the situation and make sure that we have European presence in these fora. Of course, from our point of view, the keywords are interoperability, but also delivering the economy of scale and scope, so making sure that we have an ecosystem for connectivity that is, well, makes sense economically, but then is also workable in technical terms. And there was an interesting discussion already on the consistency of standards, if you like. So we have different types of standards, we have technical standards, we have some European Commission, let's say, implementing act. We have such a thing, for example, for small cells in the area of 5G. We have some binding European norms, and I'm thinking about, for example, the eCall, which is something that where we have a binding, let's say, text behind. In cybersecurity, we could talk about certifications and labeling. So we have a whole host of different things that we kind of call the standards, and I think it would be very useful. There's no need to create bureaucracy or hierarchy to at least understand what are the tools what is the toolbox exactly that we can use for a better standardization world, and then use that consciously when we think about the way forward. Point on inclusiveness, so we also appreciate a lot that the European standardization system is inclusive and has a broad stakeholder participation. We are European stakeholders, so okay, the geopolitical discussion in a way, we are still going to be included, and I think that's from that point of view, yes, it is a little bit less controversial perhaps for us, but there is a key point, which is the economics point, and telco operators who are buying equipment from a whole global market of equipment vendors, including the Europeans, but also others. We need a global market that is wide and competitive, innovative and also affordable. So if you start limiting that too much, then there might be consequences that we don't want. Of course, we then also very much appreciate the core European principles and values, so things such as security, privacy, sustainability. We also want to reflect those values in the networks. So admittedly, it is not an easy balance to make actually then from our point of view either. Where do you draw the line so that we do have networks and systems that reflect the values, but that we don't then, in terms of the business and the commercial rationale, shoot ourselves in the foot, if you like. So that's a bit of an open question still from our side. I think then I wanted to say something about the priorities, but I think it's fairly clear from our point of view, so 5G is still key. We welcome again the harmonized or the reinforced cybersecurity requirements that came with the Cyber Resilience Act last week. Very important that in the world of IoT we have a let's say, system that we also can rely on. So operators, in fact, large operators, the networks are bringing together all these devices, different things. So we need to make sure that we have the interfaces that are standardized, and also then that all the products that are exposed directly to the networks, especially the IoT devices, etc., have certain security standards. And I think that this was a very crucial step from our side, from the security point of view. And on the reinforcement again of the European standardization system, I think just would like to say that the different fora that were announced, the high-level forum, etc., those are very valuable, and we of course would very much like to see also the communication and technology and our industry present in those fora. Because, of course, the networks and communication technology does provide the foundation for the digital economy and all these different sectoral applications, etc. So we also think that that's very important. But I think I will stop my comments here so that a colleague from Ericsson also gets a say.
If we follow the time, I have 1 minute to make my points. So I had made a lot of great points that I will not use. And I will try to be super short on reacting to some things that I've heard here today. So I'm working for Ericsson since 10 years. Before that, I worked for an SME implementing the standards. So to quote Sophie, I'm at the end of my career somewhere in a dark office in Ericsson, hoping that I'm young enough to change still to something more exciting than standards. But anyway, so a broad perspective. One thing, telecom. Telecom is very specific because telecom needs standards. Without standards, you don't have telecom. You have walkie-talkies. So it's a very specific thing. And in telecom, what we've seen is that if you go more global, you actually get better standards, you get cheaper standards, and you get basically an incredible big ecosystem in which SMEs can thrive. And so going to a lot of the topics that have been said a lot, that's a big challenge. How do you maintain that global standardization ecosystem whilst caring indeed for a number of important values that have been mentioned? And that's for telecom specifically important. Just a number, when we started standardization, GSM was early 80s. The first GSM network was launched July 1991. If you look at 1991 to today, it's only 30 years. And in that time period, 5.5 billion people have signed up for a subscription. 5.5 billion people in 30 years. It's just mind-blowing. And so the success of standardization is really clear. Brings me to the second point. We're focusing incredibly a lot on the deployment problems. And I'm always wondering, where is the problem? 5.5 billion people cannot all be wrong. You have IoT, the car companies have all taken up the technology. They're all connected. I get, unfortunately, now apps in my car pushed through. And so that's also now connected. So where is the problem on the dissemination? I don't see it. I do see a problem indeed on creating attractiveness for companies to participate, because standardization is voluntary, has been said, and if we want standardization to be qualitatively good and continue on that performance track that we have, then you need companies to be willing to contribute their own technology to the standard. Now that's a very technical thing. You know, you contribute what you've invented. As Emilio said, there are 5G, more than 100,000 contributions have been made, which means 100,000 technical papers have been made that have been discussed, and out of that then the standard has been created. And that explains why we have patents, because when you bring your technical solution to that forum, you want that solution to be protected, because otherwise somebody runs away with it. So that's why you have these patents, so that you can actually defend your idea. If your idea makes it to the standard, then you can perhaps have a standard essential patent. It's not necessarily so, because it depends on claims, etc., but that brings us too far. So, but the complexity of that is, how do you incentivize companies to do that if at the same time standardizing is actually giving away your USP? Your unique selling proposition that you create as a company goes away when you standardize, because your competitors can actually use that standard as well. And so that's a very difficult balance. That's a very complex thing, but we are faced with that reality. Brings me to dominance. I'm surprised that the word dominance is used in the framework of standardization, because SEPs are patents, but patents with a commitment that you make your technology available. Anybody, as Emilio said, that wants to use that technology can use it. Yes, you need to pay something, but what you need to pay is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. So how can you evaluate whether that's that? That's the courts. Ultimately, the courts decide. Why? Because a patent is not self-executing. I cannot waive a patent to whoever and say, you need to respect it, because he can just, copy me. Because a patent basically explains in detail what the invention is. So a patent is very open. It's super transparent. It actually explains how you make the whole thing. And so when you want to enforce that patent, you need the courts to intervene. So how can you have dominance if you make your patent available, and if you then have the courts who actually look at whether or not your offer is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory? So, there is a lot of nuance that in this debate is lost, because it's, a debate where a lot of money is involved, because there are a lot of implementers, more and more. And basically, if you need to negotiate the price that is really right after you started using the patents and after started using the technology, what you want is to get as close as possible to zero. But that, of course, doesn't allow for a sustainable standardization system to reside or to subside. And so that is the challenge, I think. So the two main challenges: international, how do we make sure that we don't lose the benefits of that international cooperation whilst making sure that our values are respected? And secondly, how do we make a system that commercially is so interesting that SMEs want to contribute their unique technology to the standardization? Because for the moment, that is a very difficult one. If you have unique technology as an SME and you want to contribute it, it is very complex to make a business model out of that. And I will leave it to that. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that we are running out of time. I just one other thing, and then see whether there are some questions from the audience. And I have to tell everyone that, just to reward those who are still with us, that after this discussion we have food and drinks, okay? And for Urska, that is remotely connected, we have food and drinks on the metaverse for you, okay? No, don't worry about that. Next event. My just 2 cents on several things that we hear in this afternoon is related to, let's say, the connection between SEP, antitrust, hold up and hold out. Okay, I do believe that is a great achievement in our discussion, the fact that we bring together, as Emilio started this concept, we bring together hold up and hold out. Because at the very beginning, the literature and I would say the US policy promoted the friend commitment as just a remedy against the risk of hold out. So we disregard the opposite view. But I see that we are still struggling to strike a balance, to see how to handle both the opposite risks. Just to mention, we know that the Huawei test in Europe has been pretty successful in terms of being implemented also in other countries. However, if we look at the final outcome, that is reducing the litigation under the threat of antitrust intervention, well, at this point, we do not see any reduction in terms of litigation. Probably this is due to the fact that we are unable to find a way to determine the economic meaning of friend, okay? I guess there's probably a sort of poison pill. And from a legislative point of view, we probably will think about how to address this topic, because if we leave this topic to the discussion and debate before the courts, we are just raising a huge amount of litigation. We still have another wave of litigation when it comes to global rates of standards of royalty settings, so on and so forth. So one I would like to hear about you in a few seconds. What do you think, if there are any policy suggestion, intervention to keep together this kind of risk and reduce the main problem that is the amount of litigation?
It's the $1 million question for the end. First, the hold up, hold out, that is a very old paper. It's a paper that dates from before Huawei ZTE, but also before eBay. So that paper is really, I don't understand why it continues to come up, because the rules have completely changed. Secondly, that paper brings the holdout knowledge, or the hold up, sorry, knowledge from a totally different economic activity into IPR licensing, which is being criticized by a number of economists as well. But so today we have Huawei ZTE, which basically renders that entire discussion, to me, a little bit obsolete. How you create incentives, that's a very good question. I just want to highlight one thing, and that is Avanci. Avanci has announced earlier this year that after 4 or 5 years of having the same rates, that they said, well, we are going to increase the rates after a while. Why? Because, you know, we have all these car companies signing up, and it doesn't sound fair that people who are signing up now have the same as the ones who signed up 4 years ago and were really willing licensees. And today they announced that they have 81 brands licensed. So it means that a lot of car companies have now all of a sudden signed up. And so is that an incentive? Is it an incentive to say, look, at a certain moment, you need to have skin in the game. If you continue to hold out, there is going to be some effect for it. Because if you can continue to hold out and then say, well, I nevertheless take friend, why would you take it in the first place? If you only have to pay as a fine for not taking a bus ticket, the bus ticket price, who would ever take a bus ticket price from the beginning? And so that is, you know, how can we create an incentive for negotiations? How can we make sure that willing licensees are rewarded for their good faith negotiation? That, I think, is a central question.
Anyone else want to jump in? Just looking for drink and food? Okay. Let me thank all our speakers for this lively and insightful discussion, and also for staying with us after the 7 p.m. Now I can switch off. Thank you.